Howdy. Welcome back to Dion Talk. I deal with a lot of new investors, and there's some really common mistakes that new investors make. Some examples are when you have fear, it stops you in your tracks. Instead of thinking, how do I mitigate this fear? Or when a new investor overanalyzes things, they develop that analysis paralysis that also stops them in their tracks. What I have today, since I deal with so many new investors, I want to talk to Dana, the CEO of Hemlane, who deals with a lot of landlords. And you can correct me on your numbers because I'm going to say the last time we talked, there was about 21,000 units on your platform and a little over 3,000 owners. So what does it look like now?
Yeah, so we're close to 4,000 with 25,000 rentals under management. So quite a few landlord rental owners who we work with on a daily basis.
Okay, so what I'd like you to do is cover your three most common landlord mistakes, and then we're going to talk about those.
Great. Number one is letting emotion get involved. And what I mean by that is you're in the service business, right? There is someone there who it is their home, and that means a lot to them. And it also means a lot to you, right? That you provide them with a great home. But if there's any sort of disagreement, such as how a repair is handled, or what the rent increase should be, a landlord who lets their emotion get involved and has a lot of anxiety is not going to do well in the long term. In part because they might jump out of the business and not want to be in the business any longer, or they may take themselves down a road where emotion plays off emotion and escalates something up unnecessarily. And I'll give you a couple of examples of it. But what I always recommend is do not let your emotions get involved. There is always something objective that you can come up with for any and every situation. So, for example, if a tenant says something like on repairs that it needs to be done by X date, and instead of getting very emotional, just refer back to the lease, refer back to the law. If here's the exact timeline and process of how we're doing things, we are following the law with it. And so I think really by taking out any sort of ambiguity and always looking back at the data and the facts and what is according to the law the right thing to do, I think that will take and kind of ease that anxiety for you as a landlord, in order to provide a great experience. And it's interesting because on both sides you see emotion. Sometimes you get a tenant, even when you're going through the screening process, where you don't know how emotional they are until they get into the property. But as long as you are able to always refer back to something that is very factual, it makes the experience much more enjoyable, both for you, and then it also de-escalates things because it's not emotions playing off of one another. It is you just saying, this is what we've agreed to, or this is how the process should work. So hopefully that's a good one, and happy to provide some more examples of it.
Yeah, so I like the thing with emotion, and it actually comes up a lot with the new investors that I work with. There are certain people who shouldn't self-manage because of their emotional state. They're either
Mhm.
too easy to escalate or they're too easy to get walked all over.
Yeah.
So if a person thinks if a tenant gave me a reason why they're going to pay their rent late, I would let them because I understand that life can be challenging. I would say that's probably somebody who needs a property manager. But if I have that new investor that says, what do I do when the tenant asks to pay my rent late? Because some tenants will specifically look for rentals that aren't with a property management company so that they're dealing with the owner thinking that they can play on their emotions. And just like you suggest, I say stick to the lease. The lease is there to protect the tenant and the owner. And for the example of a tenant asking, can I pay my rent late? That's probably one of the most common ones that comes up. I'll say, well, we take the emotion out of it, exactly like you said. We look at the lease and we explain to the tenant, there is a contract between us that says you can pay your rent late. Here are how the late fees work. And the
Yep.
day after the grace period, as the owner, I'm going to do you a favor and file for eviction, because when I file for the eviction as the tenant, you now have access to some rental assistance programs that won't even talk to you until you've been served. So when you clearly explain that to a tenant that yes, there's an agreement, here's the late fees, and you're going to get an eviction, because it's not like the tenant is sitting there going, I've had this major life event and I need your help. The tenant has this list of bills: their rent, their food, their cell phone, their transportation, and they're looking through to see which one of those they can mess with to delay. And the last thing I have the owners explain to the tenants is this thing called the math of time. So most renters have a month, about 4 weeks, to get the rent together for the next month. If you allow a tenant to pay their rent 1 week late, you've now given them only 3 weeks for the next month. So you'd be setting them up for failure. If you can take the emotion out of some of those conversations, it's a lot smoother with the tenant. And then there are those people who can't do those kind of things, don't like the confrontation, they wear their heart on their sleeve. And as much as I'm a supporter of self-management, because property management companies often make more than the owners do. I think that as the owner of the property, you should be making that money. There are times when it makes sense to have a property manager. So I totally agree on your first one. On the emotions can be a huge problem. What's your second one?
Yeah. And before I go into the second one of the things I loved about what you said was telling the tenant, here is the benefit to you of it. I've seen that, especially with pushback of like, well, why do I need renter's insurance? And I'm not going to get that because of the lease. Well, it's actually really for you, because if there's a flood and all your stuff gets damaged, my landlord insurance will not cover your stuff. This is for you to cover. So always making sure that they see the light in it. From whatever is very objective. My second one, it kind of goes with this walking all over landlords that you had mentioned. So there are tenants out there who will look online for a property that is not managed by a professional property management company. And the reason for it is then they can use the law to basically and this doesn't happen all the time. They can use the law in their favor. Tenant states that are very tenant friendly, there's a little bit more of that, but they can make it where the landlord feels like they're inadequate running the property. And so really the second one is to really understand the law, your local law, through your apartment association, through anything else, because the last thing you want is to say, great, Dion, the security deposit is 2 times monthly rent or 3 times monthly rent. And then Dion's like, no, it's not. According to the law, Dion's my tenant. According to the law, you can only charge 1 month's rent. And so really making sure that you know that, because the second that the tenant puts themselves into position of, I know the law better than you, it really provides this dynamic where from a lease perspective, the contract perspective, it seems like the tenant obviously has the upper hand. And so you want to make sure it's a level playing field. You're following the law, the tenant's following the law. And so do yourself a favor and know what that law is. An interesting one that just came out, is starting January 1st in Colorado. Pet fees. There are certain limitations on how much you can charge in pet rent and pet deposits. So all of that kind of stuff you just need to know as a landlord to make sure that there is that level playing field, that we're both mutually, this lease is signed by both of us. It's mutual. It's a level playing ground. We both understand and follow the law.
So I worked in law enforcement for 8 years. And there's these things that not too many people are aware of. I've actually met some police officers that didn't do this, but there's a thing called the LEDs, Law Enforcement Digest. Every month, different court cases were decided in different areas that impacted stop and frisk or probable cause. And a good police officer stays current on what's happening. And this is the same for landlords. You should be tracking what's changing in your local area. I'm in Washington State. The city of Tacoma just enacted some new rules inside the city limits, which I don't want to know. I just make sure that I don't invest inside those city limits, right? So you want to know of the laws in your area, be very current on them. And then I take it one step further. If you put a roof on your rental, you can be like my brother and go up there and do the roof yourself to make sure it's done right. I like to hire a pro, somebody who's taken the time and the effort to learn the skills, to have the trade, to have the warranty that's going to cover my roof. When it comes to the legal things of knowing the laws in your area, and this is something I actually learned from my brother, you should take a copy of your lease to an attorney that works where your rentals are, because they know the local court system. Show the lease to the attorney and ask them, since they are the attorney that you're probably going to retain in the case of an eviction, in this court system, is there any verbiage they suggest adding to your lease that makes their job easier if you and them end up in a court with an eviction? And my attorney gave me about probably 2 paragraphs worth of things that I never would have thought of that applied specifically to the areas where I invest. So not only should you know your laws, but I suggest going out and talking to an attorney that works in your local court system and seeing what you can add to your lease that works specifically for that area. It's not likely that going online and researching landlord tenant laws are going to be as effective as talking to somebody who works in the court system you're probably going to end up in.
I couldn't agree more with that. County law changes so much. And so there's laws obviously at the state level, but also at the county level. And so you definitely need to stay up to date with that. And it's interesting, you're right, Dion, there's ones where it's like squatter rights. And if you have some sort of squatter term in your lease, then you can just go through and change the locks much more easily. And so certain things like that, that you just want to make sure you always have in there to help yourself in any event that, or sorry, not a squatter abandonment clause, like an abandonment that you don't have to go to court for the eviction, that there's just an abandonment clause. And so you can just at that point change the locks and get it released after a certain period of time. A lot of that, even though there's upfront work with the attorney, it will save you a lot more in the end.
Totally agree. What is the third most common landlord mistake that you run into?
The third one is looking at the short-term versus long-term numbers and not actually, the easiest way, honestly, to do it is in Excel, but not looking long-term at what are the implications of certain things. And let me give you a couple of examples of that. It starts with one, advertising your rental property. Folks always want top dollar, and especially landlords that are accidental landlords where there's some sort of emotional attachment. I said, let emotions get involved. They think their property is worth significantly more, even though there's property down the street that may be $50 less. Now you might say, oh, but look, I'm going to get, an extra 100 in monthly rent. But due to the additional vacancy you'll have by trying to fill that, you'll probably lose more based on the vacancy costs. And so really making sure you're running the numbers and saying, okay, situation number one, what happens if I list it at this price, but it's on market for longer? What is the overall amount of money I make in 12 months? Versus if I list it today, but at a lower price, but I fill the property faster, what would be my overall monthly rent? And so you want to price it correctly from that perspective to not have increased days on market. Another one of not running the numbers is with lease renewals. You are so good with lease renewals, Dion, and really making sure you have those numbers up front to think of the long term. Okay, what is going to incentivize my tenant to sign another renewal? What is that renewal rate that has a rent increase that is something that is not going to have them say, oh, I'm going to move out? So really making sure you're looking at the numbers from that perspective. Because it does, if you're short-sighted and say, oh, well, I saw a new property down the street, list for much higher, well, you might risk your tenant moving out, 1 or 2 months of vacancy with turnovers and the releasing and all this stuff that does not align with your bottom line. And so really just make sure you run the numbers and really look at it holistically of the different scenarios and situations you can go through.
I completely agree with people looking at the short term instead of the long term. I actually just released a video recently, Christmas Carol version, where I read a book called Shut Up and Wait. And it is a book where you can't invest in real estate and expect your rentals to produce $1,000 a month in cash flow just because you hear of another investor that has that. But if you buy a rental, you hold it long term, you watch for rates if they ever come down to refinance, you increase your rents over time. Eventually, long term, yes, that will be a rental that probably produces that much cash flow. And I see the biggest mistake with landlords when they look at short term instead of long term is with expenses. I've actually heard investors, and I don't disagree with them because it's not my job to disagree. It's my job to educate. So I'm not trying to change people's opinions. I'm trying to share my opinion. But I'll hear people say, I want to buy a new house because then I don't have to set aside for repairs and maintenance because it'll be so long until something is needed. And that's not how it works at all. Whether it's a brand new house that was built yesterday or it's a 30-year-old house, eventually it's going to need a roof. You are setting aside for that every month starting day one. It's going to need a water heater. It's going to need foundation work. It might be in 20 or 25 years, but you still start setting aside for that right in the beginning. In other words, when expenses come, the landlord that didn't plan for long term will think If I'm making $1,000 a month and I have $1,000 expense, I lost all of my cash flow from that month. Instead of thinking, I'm setting aside money every month for when expenses come up so that my expenses don't impact my cash flow. I definitely think looking long term, and the way that I would really put this is we are investing for years before we buy a rental. So many new investors think short term. They think, okay, I want to buy a rental and get more cash flow, and then I'll be able to use that cash flow to buy the next rental. But before we buy the first rental, there was all that time that we increased our income, right? Worked overtime, learned a skill to be more attractive to our employer, changed companies for a raise, got a side hustle. We kept our expenses low. We saved the difference. We worked on our credit score. Like months for most people, for people like me, it was 2 years of saving and working on credit score before
Yeah.
buying that first rental. The longer that you think, I think the more impact that you can have, and less likely you are to do like some investors do. They give it a shot. They don't reach financial freedom in 6 months, so they give up.
Yeah. I just saw one of those last night where the tenant signed a lease and then the tenant had backed out. And so they said, oh, I'm done with this. And it was their first rental. And so to your point, it's a long-term game, running the numbers long-term and staying dead fast focused on it. You know, people fantasize and kind of dream about being a landlord in that sense of this passive income. But you have to think of the long term to be able to get there, to get to where you are, Dion, where you mentally got into that state when you were working a W-2, going through the process, and then it has set you up for that and continuing to think long term. So I couldn't agree more.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you sharing this with us today with the larger pool of people that you deal with as far as landlords go. These are three things I think new investors can work on. If people want to reach out with questions, how can they get a hold of you?
Yeah, you can reach out. Actually, email's the easiest. My email is Dana, Dana, at hemlane.com, HEMLANE.com. So I love hearing from anyone from new investors to successful investors who've been there and done that. So would love to connect.
Awesome. Thank you. Until my next video, thanks for coming to my Dion Talk.
We're sorry, the number you have dialed is not in service at this time.